The worst mistake an HOA can make isn't building on the wrong land. It's assuming the owner will never come back. The first thing I noticed wasn't the houses. It was the smell. Fresh asphalt hung in the cool Texas morning, mixing with the familiar scent of cedar trees and dry grass that had lived on my family's ranch longer than anyone still breathing. Then came the steady hum of air conditioning units, the distant bark of neighborhood dogs, and the sound that made every muscle in my body tighten. A golf cart rolling across ground where my grandfather once taught me how to mend fences. I eased my pickup truck to the top of the ridge and killed the engine. Silence filled the cab for a heartbeat before I stepped out. Gravel crunched beneath my boots exactly the way it always had, but everything beyond that ridge belonged in someone else's life, not mine. 60 nearly identical houses stretched across the southern pasture of Walker Ranch, each with fresh white fences, trimmed lawns, matching mailboxes, and perfectly planted maple trees standing where our cattle used to graze. Children's bicycles leaned against garages. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically across bright green grass. A delivery van disappeared around a corner I knew had never existed before. I just stood there, staring at an entire suburban neighborhood sitting on land my family had owned since 1949. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 38 years old, and every acre of this ranch carries someone's memory. My grandfather built the original barn with his own hands after returning from Korea. My father repaired fences every spring before I was old enough to carry a post driver. I learned to drive an old Ford tractor before I was tall enough to see over the steering wheel without sitting on a folded blanket. This place wasn't simply property. It was every lesson about responsibility, patience, and honest work that shaped the man I became. 6 months earlier, I'd accepted a long-term infrastructure consulting project in Montana. The ranch had been leased for seasonal grazing, taxes were automatically paid, and my attorney handled routine paperwork while I was away. Nothing about that arrangement suggested I'd return home to discover an entire HOA subdivision occupying my southern pasture. As I walked farther down the hill, the smell of fresh mulch replaced the cedar. Decorative stone walls lined a brand-new entrance complete with polished metal letters that read, Willow Creek Estates. Families pushed strollers along sidewalks poured across what used to be our horse trail. A man waved politely while washing his SUV, completely unaware he was standing on land that still carried my family name in the county records. Before I could make sense of any of it, a white luxury SUV rolled toward me, tires whispering across pavement that hadn't existed when I left Texas. The driver stepped out wearing spotless tennis clothes and sunglasses that reflected the morning sun. She smiled the kind of practiced smile that belongs to people who have spent years believing they never hear the word no. "You must be Ethan Walker," she said as if we were old friends. "I'm Victoria Hale, president of the Homeowners Association." She reached into a leather folder, removed a thick envelope, and handed it to me without losing that smile for even a second. The words across the first page hit harder than the August heat already rising off the pavement. Civil complaint. I hadn't even asked a question yet, and somehow they were already suing me. I did not open the lawsuit right away. Instead, I looked past Victoria's shoulder toward the old live oak standing near the edge of the subdivision. It was still there, its thick branches reaching over the same patch of ground where my grandfather used to park his faded green tractor every Saturday morning. Everything around it had changed, yet somehow that tree looked exactly the same. The breeze carried the dry rustle of its leaves, and for a second I could almost hear my grandfather's voice telling me that land always remembers who takes care of it. Walker Ranch had never been the biggest spread in Texas, but it was ours. My grandfather, Samuel Walker, bought the original 320 acres in the summer of 1949 after returning home with little more than determination and a pickup truck that barely made it across the county line. Every fence post, every cattle gate, every stock pond came from years of sweat instead of borrowed money. My father inherited that work ethic, and somehow he managed to pass every bit of it to me before cancer took him far too early. He always believed property was more than acreage. It was a promise that each generation would leave something stronger than it received. I could still remember being 12 years old, following him across the southern pasture before sunrise. The grass soaked my boots with morning dew while coyotes called somewhere beyond the cedar trees. He stopped beside a narrow gravel road that curved gently through the ranch before disappearing toward the county highway. Most people would have ignored it because it looked ordinary, just crushed limestone packed flat by decades of truck tires. Dad rested his hand on one of the weathered cedar fence posts and smiled. Never overlook the simple things, he told me. Sometimes the most valuable part of a ranch is not the land. It is the only way in or out. At the time, I thought he was talking about moving cattle. Years later, I realized he rarely said anything without meaning two different things. My grandfather had personally supervised the construction of that road in the late 1960s after spring floods repeatedly washed out the original trail. He refused shortcuts. He hired the best surveyor in the county, reinforced the drainage culverts with concrete, and planted rows of live oaks along both sides because he believed his grandchildren deserved shade even if he never lived long enough to enjoy it himself. Every summer, my father and I repaired potholes before the rainy season arrived. The smell of hot tar and fresh gravel became part of childhood, along with scraped knuckles, iced tea in old mason jars, and stories about neighbors helping neighbors without expecting anything in return. Even after I left for college and later built a career designing transportation projects across the Southwest, I always came back to that road. Driving across its familiar crunch reminded me exactly where I belonged. Looking at Willow Creek Estates now, I realized something that made my stomach tighten. Every moving truck, every delivery van, every school bus, every resident who entered or left that entire subdivision was using the same quiet gravel road my family had maintained for more than 50 years. Nobody seemed to question where it came from. Nobody noticed the old cedar fence posts still standing along its edges. They simply assumed it had always belonged to the neighborhood. As Victoria continued talking about permits, developers, and community investments, I barely heard a word she said. My eyes stayed fixed on that road while a memory echoed louder than her voice. Never overlook the simple things. Victoria finally stopped talking long enough for me to unfold the complaint. The paper still smelled like fresh toner, the edges perfectly crisp, as if someone had been waiting for the exact moment I stepped back onto my own ranch. According to the filing, I was interfering with a lawful residential development, damaging property values by challenging completed construction and threatening the peaceful enjoyment of hundreds of homeowners. I almost laughed at the absurdity. They had built an entire neighborhood on my family's pasture, and somehow I was the problem. Victoria folded her sunglasses onto the collar of her spotless white shirt and spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had rehearsed this conversation many times. You have to understand, Ethan. This community represents years of planning, millions of dollars in investment, and 60 families who purchased their dream homes in good faith. You cannot simply walk in and disrupt all of that. I looked beyond her toward children riding bicycles along sidewalks poured across what used to be our grazing fields. None of those families looked like villains. They were unloading groceries, trimming hedges, and waving to neighbors. Most of them probably believed every word they had been told when they signed their closing papers. The only person smiling with complete certainty was Victoria. She believed she had already won. Who sold this land? I asked quietly. She tilted her head as though the answer should have been obvious. The developer acquired everything through the proper channels. Surveys were completed. Permits were approved. The county signed off. Construction passed every inspection. If there had been a problem, someone would have stopped it years ago. That last sentence stayed with me. Someone would have stopped it. My father used to say that paperwork has a strange way of making intelligent people stop asking simple questions. I thanked Victoria for the documents, turned around, and drove toward the old equipment barn instead of arguing another minute. Dust rose behind my truck as the paved subdivision disappeared in the rearview mirror and the familiar gravel returned beneath my tires. The sound alone lowered my heartbeat. The barn smelled exactly as I remembered. Old pine boards, motor oil, leather saddles, and decades of hard work trapped inside weathered wood. Sunlight slipped through narrow gaps in the walls, painting bright stripes across shelves filled with coffee cans of bolts, rusted branding irons, faded survey stakes, and handwritten notebooks that my father refused to throw away. Every object seemed to carry its own story. While I searched through cabinets for property files, my phone began vibrating almost nonstop. Unknown numbers, local reporters, messages from neighbors asking if I planned to force everyone out. Someone had already posted drone footage of my truck parked outside the subdivision. The comments painted me as a greedy ranch owner trying to destroy a peaceful community. By sunset, people who had never met me somehow knew exactly who they thought I was. I stepped outside carrying a dusty box of old ranch records and watched the evening light settle across the pasture beyond the barn. From where I stood, I could see the rooftops of Willow Creek Estates glowing orange beneath the setting sun. Then I noticed something else. Every vehicle leaving the subdivision slowed at the exact same curve before turning onto the county highway. Pickup trucks, school buses, delivery vans, landscaping trailers. Every single one followed the same narrow route my grandfather had built more than 50 years earlier. I did not know what the paperwork inside that dusty box would reveal yet, but one thing had become impossible to ignore. An entire neighborhood had unknowingly built its future around a road my family had never stopped maintaining. The next 48 hours felt like I was living inside someone else's story. Every phone call brought another surprise, and none of them were good. My attorney, Daniel Brooks, drove out to the ranch carrying 2 thick folders and a look I had never seen on his face before. We sat on the old wooden porch while the smell of fresh coffee drifted between us, and cicadas hummed across the pasture as the Texas heat settled over the land. Daniel slowly removed his reading glasses and sighed. "Ethan, I have reviewed everything filed by the developer, the county planning office, and the homeowners association. On paper, they have permits, environmental approvals, engineering reports, and recorded subdivision plats. This is going to be an uphill fight." I leaned back in the porch swing my father built 20 years earlier. Its chains creaked softly with every movement, a sound I had heard since childhood. "They built 60 houses on my family's ranch," I said. "There has to be something missing." Daniel nodded without much confidence. "There usually is. The problem is finding it before a judge decides the community has relied on those approvals for too long." His words stayed with me long after he left. Later that afternoon, I drove into town to review public records myself. The courthouse looked exactly as it always had, with worn limestone steps polished smooth by generations of boots. Inside, the air carried the familiar scent of old paper, furniture polish, and aging file cabinets. Clerks moved quietly between stacks of documents while ceiling fans turned lazily overhead. I spent hours comparing parcel maps, tax records, and subdivision filings until the numbers began to blur together. Every document pointed in the same direction. Willow Creek Estates existed. The county recognized it. Utility companies serviced it. Mortgage lenders financed it. Everything appeared perfectly legitimate. Meanwhile, the local news stations ran interviews with concerned homeowners standing beside flower beds and freshly painted front porches. One woman said she feared losing everything her family had worked for. Another insisted developers had assured them the land ownership had been settled years before construction even began. I could not blame them for believing what they had been told. The comments online became even harsher. Some called me selfish. Others claimed ranch owners refused to accept progress. A few suggested I should simply take the money and move somewhere else. They spoke as though memories could be measured by market value. Victoria seemed to enjoy every minute of it. She appeared on television standing beside the neighborhood entrance with the polished confidence of an experienced spokesperson. She spoke about protecting hardworking families and preserving community stability. Not once did she mention my grandfather, my father, or the ranch that had existed decades before anyone dreamed of building those houses. By Friday morning, another certified letter arrived at the ranch. The homeowners association formally demanded that I stop entering what they described as community property without prior notice. Reading those words while standing on my own land felt almost unreal. I folded the letter carefully instead of throwing it away. Anger solves very little. Documentation lasts forever. That evening, I walked alone toward the southern pasture as the setting sun stretched long shadows across the grass. The breeze carried the smell of cedar again, stronger now that the temperature had finally begun to fall. In the distance, I watched a line of cars leave Willow Creek Estates one after another. They slowed at the familiar bend before joining the county highway exactly as they had every day since construction finished. 60 families believed they owned beautiful new homes. Victoria believed the lawsuit had already cornered me. Even my own attorney admitted the odds looked terrible. Standing there in the fading light, I had to admit it certainly felt that way. The following Monday began before sunrise. I loaded the survey map, the easement agreement, and every supporting record into a weathered leather briefcase that had belonged to my father. The drive to the county records office felt strangely different from every trip I had made there the week before. I was no longer searching for hope. I was searching for confirmation. The courthouse parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived. Cool morning air still carried the scent of fresh rain from the night before, and water dripped steadily from the old oak trees lining the sidewalk. Inside, the records department had barely opened. A clerk named Margaret, who had worked there longer than I could remember, recognized my family name before I even introduced myself. She carefully unfolded the original survey across a large viewing table beneath bright overhead lights. Neither of us spoke for several minutes, while she compared the handwritten survey with the digitized county plats displayed on her computer monitor. I watched her expression change from routine concentration to genuine curiosity. She adjusted her glasses twice before finally reaching for another archive stored on microfilm. The quiet hum of the machine filled the room, while faded property records slowly appeared on the screen. Every few minutes, she copied another reference number onto a yellow legal pad. Finally, she looked up at me. "Mr. Walker, this road has a very unusual history." She rotated the monitor so I could see the original filing. The county had approved the road construction decades earlier, but the acceptance documents stopped short of transferring ownership. The maintenance responsibility remained with the Walker family, exactly as my grandfather had negotiated. Even more surprising, the easement agreement allowed limited access under specific conditions, but ownership of the roadway itself had never left our ranch. Margaret searched through additional records to make certain nothing had changed over the years. Nothing had. The developer had recorded subdivision plats. Utility companies had installed lines. The county had approved building permits. Yet no recorded document transferred the road itself. Somehow, every later approval simply assumed someone else had already handled that step. Nobody ever verified it. I thanked Margaret and immediately drove to Daniel's office. He spread every document across his conference table while afternoon sunlight reflected through the windows onto stacks of legal books. At first, he remained silent, carefully comparing recording numbers, signatures, and filing dates. Then he leaned back in his chair and slowly smiled for the first time since this entire nightmare began. "Ethan," he said quietly, "this changes everything." He explained that ownership of the subdivision and ownership of its only practical access route were two entirely separate legal questions. The homeowners might legally own their houses. The developer might have legally built the neighborhood. But neither fact automatically granted ownership of the road crossing my family's ranch. We still needed licensed surveyors, updated title verification, and formal confirmation from the county engineer before making any move. One mistake could destroy the advantage hidden inside those old records. I agreed without hesitation. There would be no emotional confrontation, no dramatic announcement, and no rushed decisions. Everything would be verified one document at a time. That evening, I parked beside the old cedar fence where the gravel road entered the subdivision. Families returned home from work, children laughed in nearby front yards, and delivery trucks rolled past without slowing. None of them noticed me standing quietly beside the same weathered fence post my father once rested his hand upon. They believed the road beneath their tires had always belonged to someone else. For the first time since coming home, I knew they were all depending on something my family had never given away. From that day forward, I treated every conversation like it might someday become evidence. Daniel warned me that the strongest legal position is often the quietest one, so I stopped responding to television interviews, ignored social media, and declined every request to debate the homeowners association in public. Victoria seemed to mistake my silence for surrender. She continued giving interviews about protecting property values and preserving neighborhood stability, smiling confidently beside the polished entrance sign while cameras rolled. I watched every interview from the kitchen table inside the ranch house, making notes instead of arguments. Every statement, every date, every claim about ownership went into a growing binder that slowly became thicker than the lawsuit itself. Meanwhile, the real work happened where no reporters were looking. Daniel hired an independent licensed surveyor who spent 3 full days measuring the road from the county highway to the subdivision entrance. Bright orange flags appeared along the shoulders while sophisticated surveying equipment quietly confirmed measurements my grandfather had recorded more than half a century earlier. Watching modern technology validate his careful handwriting felt strangely emotional. My grandfather had never imagined satellites or digital mapping systems, yet his numbers matched almost perfectly. After the survey came the title research. Every deed, easement, transfer, and recorded amendment was reviewed line by line by a title specialist who specialized in rural property disputes. She called Daniel late one afternoon with the words we had been hoping to hear. There was no recorded conveyance transferring ownership of the roadway from Walker Ranch to the county, the developer, or the homeowners association. The developer had legally purchased surrounding parcels and constructed the subdivision, but everyone involved had simply assumed access rights came with the project. No one had verified the foundation beneath that assumption. Even after hearing the confirmation, I refused to celebrate. Assumptions lose cases just as quickly as mistakes do. We requested written verification from the county engineer's office, asking only factual questions without revealing our larger strategy. Several days later, the response arrived. The engineer confirmed that county maintenance responsibilities began only at the public highway intersection. The remainder of the access road remained privately maintained according to the recorded files. I read the letter 3 times before placing it beside my grandfather's survey. The old handwriting and the modern government letter were separated by decades, yet they were telling exactly the same story. During all of this, life inside Willow Creek Estates continued as though nothing had changed. School buses arrived every morning. Delivery drivers stopped at neatly painted front porches. Landscapers trimmed hedges with the steady buzz of commercial mowers. Families walked dogs beneath the live oaks my grandfather had planted long before anyone imagined a subdivision would exist there. None of those residents knew how close they lived to a legal question that had never actually been answered. Victoria certainly did not know. She filed another motion asking the court to restrict my access near the neighborhood entrance, arguing that my presence created unnecessary concern among residents. Daniel simply smiled when he finished reading it. "Let her keep believing the road belongs to them," he said. "The strongest surprise is the one your opponent never thinks to investigate." For the first time since returning home, I finally understood why my father always insisted on maintaining that simple gravel road every single year, even when money was tight and almost nobody used it except our own trucks. He was never maintaining a road. He was preserving the one piece of the ranch that quietly connected everything else. The hearing lasted less than an hour, but it changed the direction of everything. Victoria walked into the courtroom wearing the same confident smile I had seen since the day she handed me the lawsuit. Her attorneys spoke about completed construction, protected investments, and the hardship that any disruption would cause to 60 homeowners. They presented photographs of families, neighborhood gatherings, and beautifully landscaped streets. Listening to them, anyone unfamiliar with the history would have believed the subdivision had existed forever. Daniel remained calm. He did not argue with their photographs or challenge the families who had unknowingly purchased homes there. Instead, he placed one document after another before the court. The original survey prepared for my grandfather, the recorded easement agreement, the updated title research, the certified survey completed only weeks earlier. Finally, he submitted the written confirmation from the county engineer establishing that the access road crossing Walker Ranch had never become county property. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. Even Victoria turned toward her attorneys with a puzzled expression that quickly replaced her usual confidence. After reviewing the filings, the judge requested additional clarification before issuing any final ruling regarding access rights. That was all Daniel needed. By the following morning, every remaining legal requirement had been satisfied. Licensed surveyors marked the property boundaries one final time. The county confirmed there was no public maintenance obligation beyond the highway connection. Every document had been reviewed twice before I authorized the next step. Shortly after sunrise, a local contractor arrived with a heavy steel ranch gate that had been custom-built years earlier for another entrance we never ended up using. The smell of fresh paint mixed with damp morning air as the crew carefully installed the gate exactly where the private roadway entered Walker Ranch. Beside it, they placed a professionally manufactured sign that read, "Private Ranch Road. Authorized access only." There was no shouting, no confrontation, and no celebration. Everything happened quietly, exactly according to the confirmed property line. Around 7:30, the first school bus approached from inside the subdivision. It slowed near the new gate and stopped. A few minutes later, a delivery truck arrived behind it, followed by a landscaping trailer and several commuters heading toward work. Nobody argued with the contractor because he simply handed them copies of the recorded property documents and directed all legal questions to the county offices and the attorneys involved. Within an hour, the entrance had become the busiest place in the entire neighborhood. Residents gathered in small groups, trying to understand why the road they had driven every day was suddenly subject to private ownership. Phones rang constantly. Delivery schedules were interrupted. Service companies began asking the homeowners association for alternate access routes, only to discover there were none. Every map led back to the same quiet road my grandfather had insisted should never be surrendered. By late afternoon, county officials arrived to review the situation in person. After comparing survey markers, recorded plats, and title records, they reached the same conclusion every previous document had already established. The roadway remained privately owned. Watching those officials quietly confirm what my family had preserved for generations, I finally understood why my grandfather had written that single sentence across the old survey. He had never been protecting a strip of gravel. He had been protecting the one decision that would someday determine who truly controlled the future of the land. The days that followed felt strangely peaceful, not because the situation had become simple, but because the truth no longer depended on anyone's opinion. It lived inside recorded deeds, certified surveys, and county files that had been quietly waiting for decades. The Homeowners Association quickly shifted its strategy. Instead of demanding that I surrender the road, their attorneys requested negotiations. For the first time since I returned home, nobody accused me of disrupting the community. They wanted to discuss solutions. I agreed to meet, but only after every conversation was documented in writing. The meeting took place inside the same county conference room where property disputes had been resolved for generations. Victoria looked very different from the woman who had confidently handed me the lawsuit only weeks earlier. The certainty was gone. She listened while engineers, title specialists, and county officials explained that the subdivision itself could remain, but permanent legal access required a negotiated agreement with the owner of the private roadway. There was no shortcut around the facts. After several days of discussions, the Homeowners Association accepted a permanent easement under clear legal terms. Walker Ranch retained ownership of the road. The association agreed to compensate my family for the easement, reimburse substantial legal expenses, and correct every official record that had inaccurately suggested the roadway belonged to anyone else. Future maintenance responsibilities would be clearly defined so no family would ever face the same uncertainty again. The residents were relieved to have a permanent solution, and honestly, so was I. They had never been my enemies. Most of them had simply trusted paperwork prepared by people who should have known better. A few weeks later, I drove slowly along the familiar gravel road just before sunset. The live oaks my grandfather planted cast long shadows across the ground, exactly as they had when I was a boy riding beside my father in his old pickup truck. Children laughed from front yards inside the neighborhood. Delivery trucks completed their routes without interruption, and school buses traveled the same road every morning. Only now everyone understood why it existed and who had preserved it all those years. Before leaving the county office for the final time, Margaret smiled as she handed me certified copies of the updated records. "Your grandfather kept excellent files," she said. I smiled back because I knew that was only part of the story. He had also kept a promise. The last stop before heading home was the equipment barn. I carefully rolled the original survey back into its mailing tube and placed it exactly where I had found it. Beside it rested the handwritten note that had changed everything. I did not frame it. I did not hang it on a wall. It belonged with the history it had protected. As the evening breeze carried the familiar scent of cedar through the open barn doors, I realized my father had been right all along. Land remembers who takes care of it. People may overlook old fence posts, worn gravel, or faded documents because they seem ordinary. Yet sometimes the quietest details become the strongest foundation when everything else falls apart. Looking back now, I never won because I was louder than the Homeowners Association, richer than the developer, or more determined than their attorneys. I won because my family respected the value of doing things correctly long before anyone imagined there would be a dispute. In the end, the most important part of the ranch was never the pasture or the houses built beyond it. It was a simple road, protected by patience, proven by facts, and preserved by a promise that one generation quietly kept for the next.